The air inside the Viridian Summit chamber shimmered, not from heat but from the sheer weight of expectation. High above the clouds of Viridia Prime, representatives from over 100 worlds had gathered once again, their ships docked like jewels along the orbital ring, robes of iridescent silk, exosuits humming with quiet power, translators blinking softly at throats and wrists. It was the galaxy's grandest stage for peace, or at least the careful performance of it. And then there were the humans. They stood out not because they tried to, but because they didn't. While every other delegation arrived flanked by guards in gleaming armor, pulse rifles slung across their backs or energy shields flickering at their wrists, the Earth team walked in with 6 quiet figures in simple gray uniforms. No weapons, no armor, not even a sidearm tucked discreetly at their hips. Just calm faces, steady eyes, and hands folded loosely behind their backs. To most of the council it looked like a mistake. Or worse, arrogance. The Cathari security chief, a broad-shouldered being with obsidian skin and eyes that missed nothing, watched them like a hawk. He'd seen species come and go, some peaceful, some treacherous, but all understood one universal truth. Diplomacy without protection was suicide. So why were the humans walking into the most volatile chamber in the galaxy, with nothing but their own bodies as shields? Tension had already been building. A trade dispute between the Xylosians and the Veln had turned sharp, voices rising, postures stiffening. Then, without warning, a Xylosian bodyguard, reacting to a sudden gesture, activated his personal defense field. A low hum filled the room and blue energy rippled around him like a storm about to break. Every other guard in the chamber tensed, hands drifting toward weapons, stances shifting into readiness. Except the humans. They didn't flinch. Didn't reach for anything. One of them, a woman with close-cropped hair and calm eyes, simply turned her head slightly, scanning the room not with suspicion, but with something closer to concern. She took half a step forward, not toward the threat but toward her own ambassador, placing herself subtly between the envoy and the rising tension. The others mirrored her, shifting just enough to form a loose, quiet perimeter. No shouting, no displays of force, just presence. It was so unusual that even the arguing delegates paused, glancing toward the humans as if seeing them for the first time. Later that day, the Cathari chief filed a formal inquiry. Not out of malice, but genuine confusion. Why, he asked through official channels, do the humans send unarmed individuals into spaces where violence has occurred 3 times in the last decade alone? The question spread quickly. Whispers followed the Earth delegation through the corridors. Some called it foolishness, others a dangerous bluff. A few wondered if it was some kind of psychological tactic, making others feel guilty for being armed while they stood defenseless. But when the council's liaison approached, the human ambassador for an explanation, the reply was quiet, almost gentle, because they are not here to fight. That answer only deepened the mystery. To the rest of the galaxy, security meant deterrence. Show strength and you prevent attack. Carry a weapon and you control the room. It was logic carved into the bones of interstellar politics. But the humans seemed to operate on a different frequency. One that didn't rely on fear, but on something far harder to quantify: trust. Of course, trust was a fragile thing in a room full of species who'd spent centuries betraying one another. Many in the council assumed the humans were either naive or hiding something. Maybe their guards had hidden tech, nanobots under the skin, neural disruptors woven into their uniforms. But scans showed nothing, just fabric, bone, and breath. What no one realized yet was that the humans weren't unarmed because they lacked options. They were unarmed because they'd made a choice. A hard-won, blood-soaked choice forged in their own violent past. They knew better than anyone what happened when every handshake came with a hidden blade. They'd lived through centuries where peace talks ended in assassinations, where bodyguards fired first and asked questions never. And somewhere along the way, Earth had decided to try something radical. What if the strongest protection wasn't a weapon, but the willingness to stand in harm's way without becoming the harm? For now, though, the council just saw 6 quiet figures in gray, standing still while the galaxy braced for conflict. And that stillness, so out of place, so unnerving, was starting to make even the most battle-hardened diplomats uneasy. Because in a room full of shields and swords, the one person with nothing in their hands becomes the most dangerous of all. Not because they might attack, but because they force everyone else to ask why they feel the need to arm themselves in the first place. The humans didn't say much during the rest of the session. They listened, observed, nodded when appropriate, but their guards never relaxed, never slouched, never let their attention drift. It wasn't the rigid alertness of soldiers expecting an ambush. It was the soft, constant awareness of people who knew that violence could be stopped before it began, if you were willing to meet it not with force, but with humanity. By the time the session adjourned, the question was no longer just about protocol. It had become something deeper, something personal for many in the chamber. What do the humans know that we've forgotten? And for the first time in decades, the Galactic Council wasn't just negotiating treaties. They were watching, wondering, and quietly learning. After the strange quiet of the human guards at the Viridian summit, the whispers didn't stop, they grew louder. Some council members thought it was a trick. Others thought it was weakness dressed up as wisdom. A few were genuinely curious. So when the human delegation agreed to explain themselves in a closed briefing, the room filled fast. Even species who rarely showed interest in Earth's ways came to listen. The ambassador stood alone at the front. No podium, no screen, just a calm voice and steady eyes. Our guards aren't soldiers, they began. They're called presence officers. Their job isn't to win a fight. It's to make sure one never starts. That idea landed like a stone in still water. Around the room, armored delegates shifted in their seats. To them, security meant strength you could see, feel, and fear. But the humans were talking about something invisible, something that couldn't be measured in firepower or shield ratings. The ambassador went on. On Earth, we used to do things the way most of you still do. Every diplomat traveled with armed escorts. Every meeting had hidden weapons, panic buttons, escape tunnels. And still, people died. Not because the guards weren't good, but because the moment someone sees a weapon, even a holstered one, part of their mind braces for violence. Trust disappears before a single word is spoken. They paused, letting that sink in. So we changed. Not overnight. Not easily. But after too much blood spilled in rooms meant for peace, we asked, what if protection didn't come from threatening harm, but from refusing to cause it? Then came the training. The ambassador described how each presence officer spent years, sometimes decades, learning not how to shoot but how to listen. How to read the tiny flicker in someone's eye that means they're lying. How to stand in a way that calms rather than challenges. How to speak in a tone that lowers heartbeats instead of raising them. They studied psychology, conflict resolution, even ancient meditation practices. They learned to move through a room like water, filling gaps, absorbing tension, redirecting energy without force. But what if someone attacks? A Cathari delegate finally asked, arms crossed. What do they do then? The ambassador didn't flinch. They protect, with their bodies if they must. But never with weapons, because the moment they draw one, they become part of the problem, not the solution. To prove it, they showed a recording, old, grainy, but real. It was from Earth, decades ago, during a tense peace negotiation in a city called Jakarta. Two rival factions had agreed to talk, but tempers flared. Someone fired a shot. Chaos erupted. While armed guards from both sides raised their weapons, ready to retaliate, a single human presence officer stepped forward. Not toward the shooter, but toward a child caught in the crossfire. Bullets hit the officer, 3 of them, but they kept moving, shielding the child with their own body until others could pull them both to safety. No one else fired after that. The room fell silent. The fighting stopped, not because someone won, but because someone chose to lose everything to save a life. The footage ended. No music, no dramatic narration, just the raw truth of what happened. In the chamber, many sat stunned. For species whose cultures valued honor through strength or victory through dominance, this was almost incomprehensible. Why would anyone walk into danger with nothing to defend themselves? And more importantly, why did it work? One elder from the Velm delegation, their skin shimmering with emotion, finally spoke. You're saying your guards invite harm? No, the ambassador replied gently. They invite humanity. They show by their very presence that this space is for talking, not fighting, that even if someone tries to bring violence here, we will meet it with care, not more violence. It wasn't about being fearless. The ambassador made that clear. Presence officers felt fear like anyone else, but they'd trained to move through it, not let it dictate their actions. Their courage wasn't in how hard they could hit, but in how much they were willing to endure to keep peace alive. Some in the room still didn't believe it. "It sounds noble," said a Xylosian delegate, "but noble doesn't stop a plasma blade." "True," the ambassador said, "but neither does another plasma blade. It only makes more widows." That line hung in the air. No one argued. Later, in private conversations, a few council members admitted they'd never considered that security could be an act of trust, not just control. One Cathari guard who'd spent his life training to neutralize threats with speed and precision found himself wondering, what if I'd been taught to calm instead of crush? The humans weren't asking the galaxy to disarm. They weren't preaching. They were simply showing a different path, one born not from idealism but from pain. From watching their own world tear itself apart again and again until they realized that the real enemy wasn't the person across the table, it was the fear between them. And the most powerful way to defeat that fear wasn't with a weapon. It was with a choice. By the end of the briefing, the mood had shifted. Skepticism hadn't vanished, but it was now mixed with something new. Respect. Not because the humans were stronger, but because they dared to be vulnerable in a universe that rewarded armor. As the delegates filed out, many glanced back at the small group of human guards waiting quietly outside the chamber. They still wore no weapons, still stood with hands behind their backs. But now those empty hands didn't look weak. They looked like an invitation to believe that peace isn't just the absence of war, but the presence of courage, calm, and care. And for the first time, the galaxy started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the humans weren't the strange ones. Maybe everyone else had forgotten what real protection looked like. Not everyone was convinced. Some council members nodded politely during the briefing, but deep down, they still thought the humans were playing a long game, maybe using this unarmed act to seem noble while hiding something clever underneath. Others worried it was dangerous. If Earth's method failed even once in a high-stakes setting, it could spark a crisis that dragged half the galaxy into chaos. So a few of the more practical-minded delegates pushed for a test. Not a debate, not another presentation. A real controlled situation where they could see how these unarmed guards would handle a true threat. After some discussion and quiet pressure from the Cathari Security Command, the Council agreed. They'd run a simulation on the neutral moon of Zeta Reticuli 4, a place often used for training exercises. No real weapons, no real danger, but the scenario would feel real enough to reveal who was truly prepared. The setup was simple. A mock diplomatic meeting between Earth and a neutral alien faction. Midway through, a hired actor, trained in combat and deception, would burst in pretending to be an assassin with a neural disruptor, aiming to kill the human envoy. The goal wasn't to see who could kill the fastest, but who could stop the threat with the least harm and the most control. 3 teams would respond. The Cathari Elite Guard, known for their lightning-fast takedowns, the Veln Peacekeepers who used non-lethal containment fields, and the Human Presence Officers. The day arrived under a pale orange sky. Dust swirled gently across the training dome as delegates watched from behind reinforced glass. Inside, the human envoy sat calmly at a table, sipping water, while their 6 guards stood at ease around the room. No armor, no gear, just their uniforms and their focus. Then it happened. The door exploded inward, not with fire but with sound and motion. The assassin charged in, disruptor raised, shouting threats in a mix of broken dialects. Panic rippled through the room. Even the observers tensed. The Cathari reacted instantly. 2 guards lunged, stun batons crackling. Within seconds, the attacker was on the ground, disarmed, wrists bound, efficient, brutal, over in 5 heartbeats. The envoy was safe, but the attacker lay groaning, clearly injured from the takedown. Next, the Veln team. As the disruptor came up, they activated their fields, a shimmering dome that trapped the attacker mid-step. No contact, no injury. The threat was contained but frozen in place, unable to speak or move. Safe, yes, but also silenced. Then came the humans. The moment the door burst open, their guards didn't rush. They didn't shout. One stepped slightly in front of the envoy, not blocking, just positioning. Another moved toward the side, cutting off escape routes without appearing aggressive. A third, the one who'd caught attention at Viridia, walked slowly toward the attacker, hands open, palms visible. "Hey," they said, voice low but clear. "You don't have to do this," the attacker hesitated. just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The human kept talking, calm and steady. I can see you're scared. Who's making you do this? The disruptor wavered. In the simulation script, the attacker was supposed to be a lone extremist. But the human guard noticed something the others missed. The way the attacker's eyes darted toward a specific corner of the room. The slight tremor in their grip. The way their boots were scuffed, not from running, but from being dragged. Someone's got your family, don't they? The guard said softly. Silence. Then, the attacker's voice cracked. My sister. They said they'd kill her if I didn't go through with it. The room froze. This wasn't in the script. The simulation had been designed as a solo threat. But the human guard had read the truth in the body language, the fear beneath the rage, and instead of treating the attacker as an enemy, they treated them as a victim. Within 90 seconds, the disruptor was lowered. The attacker was sitting on the floor talking, tears in their eyes. The human guards didn't bind them, didn't stun them. They simply stayed close, offering water, listening while quietly signaling for help to rescue the sister. Outside the dome, the observers were speechless. The Kithari chief rubbed his temples. We stopped the threat, he muttered. But we missed the reason. The Velen elder nodded slowly. We contained the body, but not the pain. Only the humans had seen the whole picture, not just the weapon, but the wound behind it. Afterward, during the debrief, the human ambassador didn't gloat. We got lucky, they said, but our training teaches us to look for the person behind the action. Violence is rarely the start of a problem, it's the symptom. If you only treat the symptom, the disease comes back. One young delegate from a minor system raised a hand. But what if the attacker had been truly evil? What if there was no sister, no coercion? The ambassador met their gaze. Then we'd still protect our envoy. We'd use our bodies as shields. We'd absorb the blow so others don't have to. But even then, we wouldn't respond with violence. Because once you do, you've lost the moral ground that makes diplomacy possible. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about staying true to the purpose, peace, not power. As the sun set over Zeta Reticuli, something shifted in the air. Not a policy change, not yet, but a quiet turning of minds. The humans hadn't just passed a test. They'd redefined what the test was for. Later that night, a Kithari guard was seen practicing something new in the training yard. Not combat moves, but breathing exercises. A Velen officer asked a human presence officer how to read micro-expressions. And in the mess hall, species who rarely spoke to each other sat together, asking simple questions. How do you stay calm when someone's pointing a weapon at you? What do you do when fear kicks in? The answers weren't flashy. They were human. You breathe. You remember why you're there. You choose every second to be the calm in someone else's storm. And for the first time, the galaxy began to understand that true strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet voice that says, tell me what's really hurting you, while the world around you screams for blood. The test was over, but the lesson had just begun. After the test on Zeta Reticuli, curiosity turned into something deeper. Respect, yes, but also a quiet hunger to understand. Not just how the humans did what they did, but why. What kind of past could produce people who walked into danger with empty hands and full hearts? The Council's ethics conclave, a group of elders from the oldest member species, requested a private meeting. They didn't want tactics or demonstrations. They wanted truth. And so, in a small chamber lined with soft light and ancient stone, the human ambassador agreed to share something Earth rarely spoke of outside its own world, the century that broke them, and the moment they chose to heal instead of hate. It wasn't always like this, the ambassador began, voice low, almost tender, as if speaking of a loved one long gone. For a long time we were just like you. Every leader had armed guards. Every peace talk had hidden exits and panic codes. We believed safety meant control. Strength meant fear. They paused, eyes distant. But fear doesn't build peace. It builds walls. And walls don't stop violence, they just hide it until it explodes. Then came the story of the Geneva catastrophe. Not a war, not an invasion, but a single terrible mistake during a global summit meant to end a resource crisis. A young guard, trained to react instantly to any sudden movement, saw a delegate raise their hand in greeting. He mistook it for a threat. Fired. Killed not just the delegate, but two mediators standing nearby. The fallout wasn't just political. It shattered trust across continents. Alliances collapsed. Old enemies returned. Millions suffered because one person trained only to see danger couldn't see a human being. That day, the ambassador said, we realized our greatest threat wasn't outsiders. It was our own fear wearing a uniform. After that, Earth didn't just change its security protocols. It changed its soul. Scholars, soldiers, psychologists, even poets came together to ask, what if protection wasn't about stopping bodies, but saving relationships? They studied nonviolent resistance movements from their own history. People who stood in front of tanks, who faced down armies with nothing but song and stillness. They learned that sometimes the most powerful act isn't to strike back, but to stand firm without striking at all. The first presence officers weren't recruited from military ranks. They came from teachers, nurses, counselors, people who already knew how to hold space for pain without adding to it. Their training wasn't about speed or strength, but patience, empathy, and emotional clarity. They learned to recognize trauma in a voice, desperation in a stance, coercion in a silence. And they took a vow, not written in law, but in spirit. I will be the last to draw blood even if it costs me my life. It wasn't easy. Many failed, some died. But over time, something shifted. At summits where violence once flared, calm began to take root. When tensions rose, the mere presence of these unarmed guards seemed to lower the temperature in the room, not because they were magical, but because they reminded everyone. This is still a place for people, not weapons. One elder from the Veln leaned forward, eyes glistening. You're saying your guards choose to suffer rather than harm? Not to suffer, the ambassador corrected gently. To absorb. There's a difference. Suffering is passive. Absorbing is active. It's taking the blow so it doesn't hit the table, the talks, the future. It's saying, if pain must enter this room, let it end with me. Another delegate from a species that valued honor through sacrifice whispered, that's not security. That's a devotion. The ambassador nodded. Maybe that's what real security is. Not control over others, but commitment to something greater than yourself. They shared more stories, small ones, quiet ones. A presence officer who sat with a grieving enemy delegate for hours after news of a bombing, not as a guard, but as a human. Another who noticed a delegate slipping poison into a drink, not through tech, but through the way their fingers trembled, and stopped it by simply offering them a glass of water and saying, you look like you haven't slept in days. The would-be poisoner broke down and confessed they'd been blackmailed. No arrest, no scandal, just healing. These weren't tales of heroics. They were stories of attention, of care, of seeing people, not just positions. By the end of the session, the chamber was silent, not the silence of doubt, but of awe. These elders had lived through galactic wars, seen empires rise and fall, yet they'd never encountered a people who turned vulnerability into strategy, compassion into defense. One Cathari elder, his voice rough with age, finally spoke. We train our young to be shields and swords. You train yours to be mirrors, to show others their own humanity. The ambassador smiled faintly. We don't always succeed, but we keep trying. Because every time we choose peace over power, we prove it's possible. As they left the chamber, the elders didn't speak, but their steps were slower, their postures softer. Something had changed inside them. Not just their view of Earth, but their view of what peace could look like. Back on their ships, some began reviewing old security footage, not of battles, but of failed negotiations. They watched how guards stood, how envoys moved, how tension built like a storm no one saw coming. And for the first time they wondered, what if we've been guarding the wrong thing all along? Earth hadn't come to the galaxy to teach. They'd come to remind. And in that quiet room, surrounded by beings centuries older than their species, they'd done exactly that. The scars of Earth's past weren't hidden. They were worn openly, not as shame, but as lessons. And now those lessons were echoing through the stars, not with a shout, but with a whisper. Peace isn't won. It's chosen. Again and again. 6 cycles after that first quiet moment on Viridia Prime, the Galactic Council chamber looked different. Not in its structure, still a grand ring of polished stone and starlight glass, but in its spirit. The heavy blast doors had been replaced with open archways. Weapon scanners no longer hummed at the entrances. And in the center of the room, where once a raised dais stood for armed envoys, there was now a simple circle of smooth stone, bare, open. and unguarded. It was called the Circle of Trust, and it existed because of Earth. The change hadn't happened overnight. At first it was just small things. A Cathari delegation arriving with one fewer guard. A Veln envoy choosing to leave their ceremonial energy blade on their ship. Then came the training exchanges. Cathari soldiers learning breath control from human presence officers. Veln diplomats practicing active listening techniques developed in Earth's post-conflict zones. Slowly, quietly, the galaxy began to shift. The real turning point was Council Resolution 8891, drafted not by politicians, but by a joint team of human advisors and alien elders. It didn't force anyone to disarm. Instead, it offered a new option. Any species could adopt the human model for diplomatic security if they chose. It outlined the training, the philosophy, the long road of inner discipline required. To everyone's surprise, over 40 member worlds signed on within the first year. The Cathari created their Stillguard units, warriors trained not to strike but to stand. Their armor was lighter, their stances open. They practiced de-escalation drills alongside meditation. The Veln redesigned their ceremonial robes to include open palm gestures, symbols of peace woven into the fabric. Even species known for aggression began sending junior diplomats to Earth for presence immersion programs. Weeks spent in quiet observation, conflict circles, and empathy exercises, but the most powerful change was in the chamber itself. On the anniversary of that first summit, the day the galaxy first noticed the humans standing, weaponless, every envoy entered the circle of trust alone. No guards, no shields, just one representative from each world, stepping onto the stone barehanded, meeting eye to eye. It wasn't mandatory, but nearly every species chose to do it, because by then they understood. True safety wasn't found in armor, but in mutual respect. When the human delegation arrived that day, they didn't walk with a retinue. Just the ambassador, dressed in simple gray, stepping into the circle like everyone else. As they took their place, a hush fell, not out of fear but reverence. This was the species that had shown them another way. Not through force, not through technology, but through the quiet courage of showing up unarmed and saying, "I trust you enough to be vulnerable." Later, the Council awarded Earth its highest honor, the laurel of unbroken trust. It wasn't a medal or a title. It was a living vine, grown from seeds collected from every member world, braided together and presented in a ceramic bowl made from earth clay. The gesture was ancient, rare, and deeply human in its symbolism. Peace grows when many hands tend it. When the ambassador accepted it, they didn't give a speech. They simply held the bowl with both hands, bowed slightly, and walked back through the open archway, alone as they'd come. No escort. No fanfare. Just a person carrying a symbol of what was possible when fear is met not with more fear, but with faith. In the corridors afterward, delegates lingered, talking not about trade routes or territorial claims, but about something softer, how it felt to speak without watching someone's hand drift toward a weapon. How the air in the chamber seemed lighter now, how for the first time in generations, their children might grow up in a galaxy where peace wasn't just the pause between wars, but a living practice. Back on Earth, news of the laurel spread quietly. There were no parades, no grand celebrations, just a small gathering in a garden where former presence officers, now teachers, counselors, elders, watched the transmission together. Some cried, not from pride but from relief. Their pain, their history, their hard-won lessons, they hadn't been in vain. The galaxy hadn't become perfect overnight. Tension still flared. Old wounds still ached. But something fundamental had shifted. Diplomacy was no longer just about avoiding war. It was about building connection. And at the heart of that change was a simple, radical idea. That the strongest thing you can bring to a peace table isn't a weapon but your full humanity. Years later, young cadets from a dozen worlds would study the Viridian moment in their academies, not as a military turning point, but as a moral one. They'd watch the grainy footage of 6 humans standing still while the galaxy braced for violence, and they'd be asked, "What would you have done?" And more the answer wasn't, "I would have drawn my weapon." It was, "I would have stepped forward, empty-handed," because by then the lesson had taken root. Peace isn't protected by walls. It's grown in open spaces tended by those brave enough to stand in them without armor. And Earth, once seen as fragile, naive, even foolish for their ways, was now quietly honored as the species that reminded the galaxy what it meant to be truly strong. Not by how much you could destroy, but by how much you were willing to protect, without ever becoming the thing you feared.